If you're watching this pitching delivery with no context, which I imagine many of you are, I'm guessing it looks a little bit odd, which I understand is ironic coming from a guy who throws like this, but bear with me. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, not least of which is the fact that the catcher here is behind this net and is not actually catching the ball. But I would imagine that you might think this guy is new to baseball or was taught by someone who didn't really know the game. I imagine that you would probably not believe me if I told you that this is a pitcher that threw 30 roughly average innings in the majors, and that he was taught this motion by a Cy Young Award winner, one of the best relievers of his time, and possibly the smartest pitcher in the history of baseball. And that pitcher has an impact on the game that reaches right up to the present day, whether you know who he is or not. Even if you are an avid baseball fan, it's entirely possible that you're totally unaware of the baseball significance of Mike Marshall. If you're a baseball fan of my father's generation, you might remember him as a pretty good reliever from a time when closers were called firemen and came into the game in the 7th inning. But Mike Marshall's baseball impact is much deeper than just his performance on the field. I'm sure most of my teammates would have no idea who he was if I asked them, even though, whether they know it or not, almost every day they do drills that Mike Marshall came up with, or at least are based off of his work. We use technology every day that he thought was essential for baseball players, decades before anyone else in baseball really understood or appreciated their importance. Mike Marshall holds no fewer than 4 baseball records that no one will ever even come close to catching, and his effect on baseball reaches past his playing career. But unfortunately, he was so far ahead of his time on some of the things he had figured out that we're only just catching up to them and really understanding them now. And at the time, he was seen as an eccentric madman, an image that wasn't helped very much by the fact that he was also, in fact, kind of an eccentric madman who tried to invent a new pitching motion after his career was over. Mike Marshall was signed by the Philadelphia Phillies in 1960 out of his high school in Sylvester Stallone's favorite city in Michigan, Adrian. He played a few years as a shortstop, making it as far as Double-A before his bat no longer made up for his lack of fielding ability, and he converted to being a pitcher as he was considered good enough to do both professionally. He was traded from the Phillies to Detroit before the 1966 season and made his major league debut for the Tigers the following year. However, they sent him back to the minors the year after that, and he was eligible to be picked in the 1968 expansion draft where he was selected by the Seattle Pilots. After that, he bounced around between a few different teams before landing with the Montreal Expos, where he started to find his feet and put together a few solid seasons. In 1973, he threw well enough to finish second place in the Cy Young voting, something that was pretty much unheard of for a reliever at the time. In 1974, Marshall would be traded to the Dodgers, where he would put up both facial hair and numbers so absurd out of the bullpen that he left them no choice but to give the Cy Young Award to a relief pitcher for the first time in history, with Marshall receiving 17 of the 24 first-place votes. Was it his record or ERA? No, they were fine, but not nearly as impressive as the fact that Marshall threw 208 and 1/3 innings and appeared in 106 games out of the bullpen. For perspective, when Clayton Kershaw won the Cy Young Award and the MVP in 2014, he threw 10 fewer innings as a starter than Marshall did out of the bullpen in 1974. Marshall threw the 3rd most innings of any pitcher on the 74 Dodgers. Only Don Sutton and Andy Messersmith managed to log more innings than Marshall. According to manager Walter Alston, Marshall's workload actually allowed them to carry only 9 pitchers instead of the 10 that were traditional at the time, and Marshall's endurance earned him the nickname Iron Mike. On the all-time leaderboard for games pitched in a single season, Dr. Mike sits at the top by a margin of 12 games. He appears 3 times in the top 7 spots of the list, an honor shared by only Kent Tekulve, the legendary sidearming closer for the Pirates. However, the most innings Tekulve threw in any of those years was 135 1/3, and the fewest innings Marshall threw in any of those years was 142 2/3. They didn't call him Iron Mike for nothing, I guess. When Marshall wasn't busy being the human embodiment of a pitching machine on the field, he was being a scholar off of it. He studied kinesiology at Michigan State University in the off-seasons, earning his doctorate in the subject while he was still an active major leaguer, and teaching the subject as well, allegedly lecturing at local universities when playing on the road. He claimed that at one point he used the Michigan State supercomputer to determine 6 sequences of his pitches that he could use to keep all types of hitters off balance. In 1967, after his rookie year, Marshall noticed that he had lost some range of motion on his throwing elbow, and considering his cerebral nature and interest in kinesiology, it's not too surprising he decided to look deeper into the matter. After some measurements confirmed that he had lost 12 degrees of motion in his throwing elbow and he had x-rays comparing his left and right elbows, he decided that he needed slow motion video taken of his pitching mechanics. This may sound pretty normal, but you have to remember this was 1967, and not everyone had a camera capable of 240 frames per second slow motion video in their pocket. So Marshall went to a lab at Michigan State University and had the video taken there. And I'm sure he pored over the video, as so many of us do, seeing what he could find and identify and fix, evidenced by the fact that he uploaded this video to YouTube 44 years later. He says that conventional pitching coaches love his pitching mechanics, and to be fair, watching them, they look pretty damn good. It is difficult to say what, if anything, Marshall changed after reviewing this footage, considering that the slow-mo of his delivery in 1967 is higher quality than the surviving TV broadcasts of the rest of his career. According to a response Dr. Marshall had to a comment on his YouTube channel, he says that he didn't devise the body action of the Marshall pitching motion, which is this thing, until after he was done playing, but he did use the arm action that he had determined to be the safest. And that brings us back to what we started with, the Marshall pitching motion. A pitching motion that looks as outlandish as any picture of Marshall's facial hair from his playing days. This was Marshall's solution to pitching injuries. He said that the Marshall pitching motion used the larger muscles of the body to generate force in a way that is more sustainable and safer for pitchers. He was convinced, and may well have been right, that this motion will prevent any and all injuries related to pitching. However, there are a few issues with the theory that he had going into it. Marshall played at a time where velocity wasn't really measured and certainly wasn't considered as part of the equation nearly as much as it is today. As you might expect after viewing it, with the Marshall pitching motion, you simply cannot generate that much velocity, with Marshall pitchers with verifiable records only topping out around 80 miles an hour. There were some who trained under Marshall that threw harder than this, but when they threw harder, they used a much more conventional-looking motion that was sort of a hybrid of Marshall's principles and a more conventional pitching delivery. And again, Marshall himself didn't pitch with the delivery that he devised, since he didn't come up with the whole thing until after he was done playing. But he said the arm action of the Marshall motion, which he did use, is what kept his arm healthy throughout the insane workload he had in his career. He also claimed that if he had used the full Marshall motion that he had devised later, he would have been even better. And that is neither here nor there, since we will never know if that's true or not. But Mike Marshall didn't wait until after his career was over to challenge baseball conventions. He challenged them as he played. He lifted weights, something that was reserved only for football players at the time, and he threw every single day, believing that throwing more is what would allow him to stay healthy. Specificity, he said, is the key to my training. Pitchers should pitch and hitters should hit. Marshall threw a screwball, often considered to be an arm-ruining pitch, which caused him many disagreements with pitching coaches throughout his career. He believed the screwball was actually a healthier off-speed pitch than a curveball, since the active pronation required to throw it activates muscles that help stabilize the elbow, therefore protecting it. He was a man of high intellect, and he didn't shy away from showing it. Once, when questioned about his screwball by a reporter, he responded by referencing Bernoulli's principle, which, as we all know, is the law of fluid motion. The diameter and gravity are both consistent, so velocity and pressure are the only variables. If velocity increases, the pressure decreases, and vice versa, he said. In fairness, this does explain why objects like baseballs change motion mid-flight, but it is not exactly an answer that many people will really understand. He often answered questions this way, using scientific terms that sounded well above the heads of any layperson listening, rather than attempting to explain it in a more approachable way. Another time, when asked how he could throw nearly every day, he responded by saying, "I could explain why, but I don't have the time and you wouldn't understand because of your lack of physiological background." Marshall refused to sign autographs outside of events where he had to, claiming that it contributed to the hero worship of athletes that he so disapproved of. Marshall claimed that he didn't really care about winning or stats or records, just the thrill of competition. In an interview many years later, he said his dream was to be a high school football and baseball coach, not a baseball player. And in fact, the only reason that he played professional baseball was to finance his higher education, which his family couldn't otherwise afford. He was, in so many ways, outside the mold of what a baseball player was supposed to be, and so much of baseball seemed to hate him for it. But blinded by Marshall's unusual methods and somewhat abrasive personality, the baseball establishment missed something. The fact that Mike Marshall was correct on so many things. 1974 is a significant year in baseball history for reasons other than Mike Marshall's otherworldly endurance out of the bullpen. One of Mike Marshall's teammates, Tommy John, underwent a new surgery, the first of its kind, and a surgery that thousands of pitchers after him would undergo as well, myself included. One source I read says that it was Marshall himself that suggested the radical new procedure to Tommy John as a solution for his injured elbow. The Dodgers team doctor, Frank Jobe, who had performed that surgery, was an admirer of Mike Marshall's and said that no one in baseball understood their pitching motion and how the body worked as well as Marshall did. After Dr. Jobe performed the first UCL reconstruction surgery, better known now by the name of its first recipient, Tommy John had no idea how to rehab from this new surgery, and neither did anyone else really, so John asked Marshall for his advice. Marshall gave him a series of exercises to do with what John described as a shot put, a heavy iron ball that would become a staple of Marshall's training programs later on, and John said he did them for the rest of his career. He said when he was with the Oakland Athletics, they did testing on some of the pitchers in the organization, and he was found to have the strongest and most flexible shoulder, which he attributed to doing the exercises that Marshall had given him over a decade before. Marshall would also open a consulting service for athletes that wanted his advice, and had happy customers in quarterback Fran Tarkenton and tennis player Stan Smith. Marshall understood the importance of high-quality, high-frame-rate video all the way back in 1967, a time when broadcast quality looked like this. He recognized this importance almost 50 years before the use of high-speed footage would become commonplace in baseball for both mechanical analysis and designing more effective pitches. One of the hottest topics in pitching today is seam-shifted wake, which is what makes sinkers and changeups and some of those big sweeping sliders move the way they do. This is something that has only really begun to be understood in the last couple of years, and yet Mike Marshall understood it and describes it in his free online book that he published in 2003. He refers to it as the Marshall effect.
But what he describes is very much seam-shifted wake, where, because of the nature of the seams on the baseball, if they're in certain orientations, they change the way that air passes around the ball and how the ball moves, pushing it harder in one direction than you might expect.
Marshall claimed to have thrown these pitches when he played, so it's entirely possible he understood seam-shifted wake 50 years before anyone else in baseball.
Mike Marshall passed away in 2021 at the age of 78.
And he left behind an interesting legacy between his immense talent on the mound, his eccentric personality off of it, and his unorthodox ideas about the future of pitching. One writer might have put it best when they said, "There isn't a team in baseball that wouldn't have wanted Mike Marshall if he could keep the right arm and throw the rest away." Marshall was a nonconformist, and more often than not in those days, baseball didn't take kindly to those who didn't fit the mold. But times change, and at the very least, Mike Marshall lived to see much of the work he dedicated his life to vindicated, and in some form, much of it finally got adopted into the mainstream of baseball.